Thank you. Unless you need it on. Do you need it on me? I figure it's easier to see that. Yeah, right? All right. Hi. Hello. Thank you. It's marvelous to be back. And if you haven't found each other, there are 2 more chairs in the middle over here. Oh my goodness. What a beautiful group of people. What a marvelous energy you all are. It's a delight to be here and be with you. It's kind of reminiscent of how I felt when the plane was beginning to come into the San Francisco Bay Area, where I have been in school 3 different stages in my life and worked a couple of times, and I'm coming over the observatory, and then I'm coming over, okay, he's insisting. Can you still see?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Coming over downtown San Jose, Mountain View, Palo Alto, Redwood, sitting back. Oh, familiar. Familiar. I spent 3 weeks in constant unfamiliar. The only thing that was familiar was the food, because I grew up on curries and puris and chapatis and palau and biryani. So that was all wonderful, and I was the only one in the group who thought so. It was kind of fun. So starting in Bombay, flying to Udaipur, driving to Jaisalmer, and then out to the desert where that camel thing happened. Then driving to Jodhpur, Bikaner, Jaipur, Agra, and then an overnight train ride to Varanasi. Now, you can see what the scale is on there.
Yeah, that's huge.
We traveled a lot and spent 2 nights in each of those cities and stopped once or twice on each journey in other cities. So saw a lot of that part of India. Our driver was Sikh, and our traveling guide helper was a Christian from the lineage of the Portuguese missionaries a long ways back. So it was a fascinating experience. In each town we'd have a different person who was taking us around to what he considered the things we ought to see. But our group leader liked to shop, so we didn't get to see all of those things. And that was cool too, because some of the places we shopped were pretty wonderful. So, oh well. I'm not going to give you the travelogue, but I did want to be able to give you a sense of what the experience was. And before I left, I set the topic of universalism in northern India. This was almost 100 years to the day from the time my grandmother arrived in India. And when she arrived, the British were very much running the show. However, the India that she knew was much more like the India I experience today than the experience any of you may have had if you traveled there, you know, as a youngster in the 70s, right? Because at that point, India was really, really struggling with a lot of major issues that has since been turned around. So I never once had a child begging for money. I only once had a very young woman carrying a baby begging, and that was in a train station. We had a number of situations where there were street vendors saying, buy this, only this many rupees. But it felt like these were people who are making a living doing this. It didn't feel like people who were desperate to get a little bit of cash. And that was the kind of India my grandmother had the experience of. It was where people were doing reasonably well. There was more of a middle class feel, although it's an incredibly diverse culture. And middle class in India is nothing like middle class here. So let's see if I can get my little marker to work now. It was just working in India. Oh, you're not going to. I'm going to bounce. So contrast, I think, is the #1 thing about India. This is coming into Bombay from the airport. Mumbai is the official name, but it's interesting. The changing of names to the original Hindi has only been accepted by the government, not by the populace. So, for example, Varanasi is Benares as far as everyone is concerned, and Mumbai is Bombay. This is coming into town. You can see that, you know, skyscrapers are the norm. This is the fishing clans. These are fishermen who have been there for centuries. And the caste system is very much alive in India still today, although we are beginning to see some shifts out of it. These people have been fishermen and women for centuries, have always been, expect to always be. And so this is where they are living, and forget the skyscrapers just around the corner. And why were you were working just a moment ago, why are you not working now? Let's see if you're working. Yay! So driving on the bus, this is the main street. You know, KFC and, you know, Papa whatever, and, you know, all those kinds of things that we're used to show up all over. But the side streets are all the little merchants. And on the main streets, it's all Western dress, and on the side streets, it's more traditional dress. Lots and lots of scooters and motorbikes, but also pedicabs and other interesting things. Another thing was the contrast between the modern. This is the Mumbai airport, and this is the art in the art gallery owned by one of the friends of the people I was traveling with. It's a goddess collection, and I'll share that with those of you who are interested in the goddess. Whereas, you know, just walking down the street, this is an artist in his art studio producing, you know, tourist art on his knees, using a skylight for his daylight, and then you know, lots and lots and lots of carvings. This is a piece of a temple that was destroyed when the Muslims came into India. Part of the reason Buddhism is so powerful in Tibet is because a king of Tibet, along about 800 something, had a vision in which he saw that Buddhism was going to be destroyed in its own country. And so he did a search, and he found, quote, a living Buddha who was brought to Tibet and spent 25 years figuring out how, and then began to establish Buddhism as the primary way of being in the Tibetan world. And you know, in fact, when the Muslims arrived in India, they virtually destroyed Hinduism, in part by destroying many of the temples. So if you think about India, and this is true of every place in the world, but it was so clear to me, I could see it, and I'll give you some evidence for it along the way, of the layers and layers of invasions and cultures. So we have the original tribes, and there are still tribal groups all over the country. I got to see one of them up in the desert. And they were overtaken by the Vedic warriors, who we are taught are gods, Indra and Vishnu and those guys. These were the warriors who came in herding, you know, with their herds and overran the villages. And then those warriors were overtaken by a priesthood based on the Upanishads that said, no, you can't do it that way, you have to do it our way. And so the priesthoods became the new people in charge. And the priesthood was the group, and the warriors and the priesthood together was the group out of which Gautama became the Buddha. And then about 300 years later, after Islam began its spread, we get a few other things happening. But the Vedic priesthood was what was running the show when the Persians began to show up. And they began to show up when the Greeks took over the Persian Empire. So we're looking shortly after Alexander, 300-something BC, I'm still looking at, right? And then, so the Persians are the Parsis, and that was the first group of locals that I met, were a group of Parsis. They're eating their traditional Indian foods, but they're drinking wine, and they are, you know, they're not interested in the Hindu gods at all, and they don't even want to speak Hindi. Yeah, so when I said thank you in Hindi to them, they laughed. That was kind of fun. And then the next group that comes in is, you know, the early Christian missionaries. Thomas, the disciple, is said to have been in India, and there's a lot of evidence for that. That early are the early Christians coming into India. And they spread throughout the country. And then we finally get the Muslims, the Mughal, who are often called Mughal, and who are the warrior kings. And I'll share a little bit of what we experienced during that. And then we get the Portuguese, who are merchants and missionaries, and then we get the British, who are planting plantations and selling things. And finally, we have the American global culture of McDonald's. So, yeah. And all of that is currently happening in individual households, individual villages, individual neighborhoods. And it's fascinating. So one of the things, though, in almost all of those traditions, the men and women are separated, mostly. But if you're on the street during the day, you will see men, and inside you will see women. We saw these groups of women because we were there during a very special time of the year. It happens that in the Hindu tradition, the new year is the first new moon after the spring equinox. It's not on the spring equinox, it's the new moon. So we were there like a day or so after that new moon. And the first 9 days are devoted to the celebration of the divine feminine. And it has a slightly different pronunciation, but it's basically Gaundol, G-A-U-N-D-O-L, in various pronunciations around the region. And so these women in the first corner are in a relatively public space, but it's also private. So they're up on a roof above a public square, beginning their daily ritual around Gaundol. And the women in the middle picture have paraded through town chanting and have arrived at the local temple and are continuing to chant, or were chanting, and they had taken a break when my friend took that picture. And I didn't have the guts to take a picture of women in a temple, so I let her do it. I figure women in a temple doing their religious service don't need to be, but they were in a break, so it was okay. And notice there's always a little one or two around. And the predominant color is red. And that is, you know, a wedding color. It is the color of joy. If you know anything about China, also, it's that color of celebration and joy. Women inside, this is a cafe in a store that is, you know, it's interesting, all the clerks, most of the clerks are men, and most of the customers are women. And the waiter is a man, but it's designed for women. So it's an odd kind of separation of who gets to do what, where, when, how. And another kind of separation is the caste. This woman was born into a cleaning caste. She will clean the rest of her life. Any children she has expect to clean, unless they pick up on the incredible amount of education that's going on. Everywhere I went, virtually all the billboards were educational institutions. And some of them said the medium is English. There are a lot of schools that are based in English in India right now, as well as Hindi. And most of them are science and technology oriented. This man is probably the last generation of his family to weave this incredible silk. You know, tiny, tiny silk fibers on this jacquard loom, so he doesn't have to track which weft to, you know, which warp threads to lift to get his weft through. He just tracks which particular color at which particular point to produce elephants, peacocks, and those things this big on that loom. And though, you know, his family, he's probably the last one because the kids are going to school, right? And so they are not going to continue to weave. And the silk merchants that I was talking with were really heartbroken about it. They love this stuff. And there were patterns on their shelves that they will not ever receive any more of because no one knows how to do it. This fella is one of the ones who broke through. He grew up in the caste that raises and trains and drives elephants. They don't do it very nicely. Unfortunately, the elephant training process in India has been terribly, terribly abusive. And he grew up in that caste and woke up one day and found that there is a group of people from India. This is not Americans. Too many of the rehab stations in India are Americans. This is the Indians for Indians, and he now trains people in a rehab center for elephants that have been abused. And we got to see some of those elephants. And one of the things that they do is they make sure that when they eat, for example, they have to work a puzzle to get to their food. So they get some intellectual stimulation. They all have a bathtub in their pens. They all have all kinds of fun things to keep them busy. So the other piece of this that I like is this building was a shipping container. So it's not essential anymore that you must be stuck in your past. The other piece of what this group is doing, he became a teacher. They're training people to produce fabric and other goods that can be sold to help, give the people an income who used to be driving these elephants. So, and they're doing legislation and all that kind of stuff. Conflict is expected. When I walked in, got off the airplane and was going from international to local, because I had to get on another airplane, I passed 5 armed guards who had to see my passport in 5 different stations in that airport. It was expected that there was going to be a problem. And armed guards everywhere. At the Taj Mahal, armed guards everywhere. Anywhere tourists were likely to gather, anywhere in the middle of the street if there was going to be an issue, they were armed. And they were sometimes armed with rifles. So that was one piece. Another piece was, if you go back to that map, we were very close to the Pakistani border. In fact, I was probably looking at Pakistan when I was on the camel. And on that road from Jaisalmer to Jodhpur, and a little bit going into Jaisalmer, we passed half a dozen military bases in very high-tech, very active duty, and I did hear military jets when we were staying in Bikaner. So they are a nation at war. And when I was getting ready to leave the country, my flight was canceled because it was supposed to go over Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it couldn't. So I had to go a different route, which meant my 26-hour flight became 48 hours. Yeah. All right. So it's a very intriguing set of contrasts, and they're doing the best they can. We got all these different religions all working together. The Muslim mosque, the Vedic temples, this is a temple to Ganga, and there's a temple, an image of Mother Ganga in that. This is a Jain temple, this is another Jain temple, and how you know that it's Jain and not, or Jain or Jain, they actually say Jain. I grew up on Jain, so it's hard for me to get this. AI is A in India. If you're seeing the seated figure who looks like a Buddha, if his eyes are wide open, he's a Jain prophet. If his eyes are half closed, he's the Buddha. Right? So there's a nice little thing. And there are 9 Jain prophets, and each of them represent an aspect of the human divine experience. And the same thing with the Hindu tradition. Each of the, quote, gods are actually aspects of the divinity that are expressing through that one being. And then this is the temple where those women were chanting. It's the remainders that they patched together from what the Muslims had destroyed almost 1,000 years ago. So the traditions, 80% of India is Hindu, either by religion or by ethnic orientation. Okay? Some of our wonderful Jewish members are not really religious Jews, you're ethnic Jews, right? And some of us are, not really religious, whatever our family was, we are that. Or maybe we grew up, our family is mostly Swedish, but, we're ethnically Swedish, we aren't really practicing being Swedish, right? It's the same kind of thing. A little over 10% of India, all over the state, and someone noticed when I was playing a video, I have lots of material I'm not sharing, that as we were going through a stretch of maybe 5 miles of Bombay, we passed 3 mosques in 5 miles in Bombay. So the Muslims aren't all in Pakistan. And that's part of why the guards are always on guard, because they don't know at any given time when something's going to erupt, right? But then we get all these other traditions that have been introduced over the years. Now the Jewish tradition in most of India is pretty hidden, but in Kashmir the Jewish community is quite present. And in fact, the gal that was leading our group, periodically people would say, "You look just like Indira Gandhi." Remember the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi? And she does. She has the same face shape, the same eyes, and everything. And she's had her DNA done, 99% Ashkenazi Jew. But Indira Gandhi grew up in Kashmir. Yeah, so these kinds of things kept coming into my awareness. You know, little things demonstrating the historical thing. So after the camel ride in the desert, we were serenaded. It's a harmonium, a set of drums, kind of like a tabla, and then flat board castanets. Yeah. So that desert tribe, it turns out, does the same dances as the gypsies do in Romania.
Cool.
And in fact, their dances are identical to a whirling dervish in almost exactly the same outfit. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's all one thing unfolding in many, many different ways. And that, you know, that tribe, part of how I know it is the gal who was doing the dancing, you can look, there's a YouTube called The Gypsies Not Wandering Anymore, something like that. Find it, because it shows this dance, right, that's going on in Romania. And this woman is wearing something on her head, and after a while you become aware it's a flame. This thing's on fire, a pot of fire. Very Zoroastrian. And, well, that's what the dancer did with that night. And I wasn't in a position where I could film the dancing. But it was the same dance, done by a woman, in the same outfit. It's just beautiful to feel that connection, and to know that this thing has been going on for thousands of years, in spite of all the things that all the conquerors have attempted to do. The morning I woke up in Jaipur, this is what I heard. Can you hear it? It's the morning call to prayer. And the birds. And then there's a flute. So this is my hotel in Jaipur. About $60 a night. There's the flutist down there on the ground, red turban. The sun hasn't come up yet. The area around this beautiful, beautiful building, this is a mansion. Haveli is what they call it throughout northern India, these mansions that were merchants' mansions. And they were built often to copy the palaces that were in the forts on the hill above the town. And the area is just your normal street scene. So there's this gate in the middle of the street scene, and you enter into this kind of paradisical environment. But Jaipur is supposed to be a Hindu town, and there we were hearing the call to prayer from at least 5 different places before sunrise. And it was like, okay, we're going to combine the two, mix the two over and over again. All of the palaces that we saw, including the Taj Mahal, which is a mausoleum, not a palace, but all of those major structures were all built by the Muslim invaders. Some of them incorporated some of the Hindu religious tradition. There was one that was preceding the Muslim invaders, and the Muslims came through and painted over all the paintings because they didn't want all those dancing girls in their environment. This is one of the things that is an ancient, ancient tradition that is being continued, and that is, you know, lining the path with rose petals. The lining, the edge is a marigold strand, one continuous white marigold strand. I'll go back and let you see that again. And then they had these huge baskets of, you can see he's got this bag, and the bag is plastic, unfortunately, but they were in larger baskets of the petals that someone has gathered. And there's going to be a celebration. It's like a wedding, and we got to see it before the wedding. Yeah.
So does the fragrance come through?
Oh, yeah. 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 And that's on a lake, so it's moist as well. Yeah. Two of the cities that we were in have artificial lakes and then palaces in the middle of the lake. And this is one of them. And again, built by the Muslim invaders, not, you know, by the people who were there before. So one of the layers over the top. So this is a Hindu tradition with the rose petals and a building that was built by the Muslims. And that kind of thing happens over and over again. It's layers and layers of history. I did have a moment directly in front of the Taj. And it was interesting because that was not going to be the highlight of my trip. I was expecting all kinds of other things to be more important to me, and things shifted and changed, and it wasn't quite as I anticipated. But you know, the morning we arrived at the Taj was before sunrise, and there's this huge, beautiful gate, and you know, dozens of us are walking through the gate, and it happened that I had this brief moment directly in front of it, and I just like came home. I was like, oh, hello, old friend. I don't know what that's about. But the gate was this building, and it's exactly parallel. It's, you know, I'm standing on that platform over there, looking at this, taking this photograph. And the picture that some of you have, I had just stepped over to the side, and that's the one that Sally used for the newsletter, that the guide insisted on taking. I tried not to have too many pictures of me on this trip. But every now and then someone insisted. So, layers of history. It turns out the guy who built this, built it for his fourth wife. Not his first wife, his fourth wife. His fourth wife was the granddaughter of a Persian administrator who had taught her how to administer. Persians taught women how to do things. Parsis taught women how to be attorneys, how to be administrators, all kinds of things, where Muslims definitely did not teach their wives that. So this Muslim married this Persian woman, and she became his right-hand person. She was the one who got everything done in the kingdom. And when she passed away, he wasn't just heartbroken, he was incapable of functioning. And within 2 years, his son took over. Now, the gate, it's perfectly symmetrical in its layout. The minarets, the building, everything about it is perfectly symmetrical. There's 4 buildings, 2 gates like this, and then 2 mosques, or a mosque and a guest house built like a mosque. Well, later, someone said, I want to go see the baby Taj. I'm going, the baby Taj, okay. So we go to this building, and it's perfectly symmetrical. It's got the same kind of inlay work that's on the Taj. It's got this gate structure, notice the similarities. And, well, it was built by her grandmother. The wife that is in the Taj Mahal, her grandmother built this for the grandfather. So we have Muslim and Persian in this one, and then Muslim mostly, but a fair amount of Persian influence in this one. And it's almost 100 years apart, and most of the elements of this are in this. It's just bigger. So that's the kind of thing I saw over and over again. Something that we thought of as this thing was in fact incrementally developed, just like cell phones. Right? Yeah, we started with, I have this great image, it's a cartoon. There's an old-fashioned desk phone on one side of the cartoon, and over here are 3 little cell phones running in saying, Grandma, Grandma! And that's a lot how I felt as I moved through these places in India was, you know, not only overlaying cultures, but this incremental shift. Oh, there's an element from here and an element from there, and we'll bring that together. And a whole lot of respect for all of it. People of all different cultures, not just around the world, but from India. People from southern India coming up to these places. People from western India going to eastern India, etc. It was just amazing to get that sense of there was that, this is all us. This is all of us. Okay? So even though a lot of these constructions represent, you know, an overshadowing and a destruction of stages in our history, people were honoring these places. Here's some examples. This was a court that was built by one of the Maharanas, which is a great warrior, not a Maharani, who was a great queen, or a Maharaja, who was a great king. And here's some of the detail work on it, and then here's some of the detail on the Taj Mahal. This is precious stone, semi-precious stone, carnelian, jade, lapis lazuli, and you can see where a couple pieces have come out. There are people who come every week to continue to work on it, descendants of the original builders. So we saw the development of what became this great wonder. For me, there were some completions on this trip. The Taj, I didn't expect to be. I did expect this to be. We went out on a boat and came back by sea across the bay to this gate, almost to the day, 100 years after my grandmother came by sea to this gate, the Bombay Gate, which was built in the late 1800s, and she was there in the early 19s. And she went from there on a train to New Delhi, and from New Delhi, where she got her initial training, which included her first meal with a British family, and where they were very kind, and they offered her potato chips. After letting her know we only eat with a fork, we never eat with fingers. That was one of my favorites of her stories when I was growing up. She also went on to Lucknow and up into the mountains from there. I didn't get to repeat any of that. But to be able to stand there and to feel what it felt like to arrive where she thought was going to be the rest of her life. You know, this was the gate to the rest of her life. Was a very powerful experience. And it was very similar. I mean, there was some modern dress, but pretty much people in traditional dress trying to sell me postcards, just like they did to her. Some of the other things that helped me were, you know, this was the kind of room that the British were living in. And this was the kind of room that she would have stayed in, and that many of the people that we read about in that time, these are both pieces of palaces. This is off the main dining area of one, and this was, believe it or not, my bedroom. Oh, wow. In another one. Wow. I know, it was 1,000 square feet for a single room. Yeah. This is a 100-year-old house. The mother-in-law with our hostess, the PhD, who invited us in to eat, and her two helpers. This was the only Hindu temple we went to that was fully painted. And it reminded me of being in Chartres Cathedral. At night, they project the colors onto the building that were originally painted onto it. And it's almost identical to this temple. So something is continuing there. The one in the middle here is the Sikh temple in Agra. And marvelous, we got there right as they were cleaning up from serving, 500 people a meal, a free meal. Sitting on the Ganges down here, another temple. This, I had to take a photograph of. This was part of the summer palace in one of the forts, at Jaipur actually, and it was the air conditioning unit. It's a tall screen. The whole thing is about 6 feet tall. This arch is about 6 feet tall. And the water flows over it, and the air blows through it. And the water then goes out into the garden, but that cools the space. Okay? And we saw this kind of air conditioning over and over again. Now I have to tell you, from the day we arrived until the day we left, the daily temperature was 42 degrees centigrade, 105, which is why these clothes. You wear very, very thin fabric covering your body, right? So these kind of air conditioning units and the kind of built-in assumptions, as opposed to what was present in all the modern stuff, these little, just like ours. But they were always set for, 20-something. Coming into Benares, which is also known Varanasi, one of the things I was able to do is get a close-up of the Ganesha that is at every door in India. These are the silk merchants. This was one of the patterns they will never see any more of. These were some of the last patterns, pieces of that. This is the bookstore that probably is my favorite bookstore in the world, and I used to have one that I loved in France, but wow. First of all, it's almost all spiritual stuff, so that's cool, and it's also a publishing company, but we have an altar here, and the altar has a little Buddha, a little Hotai, and it has Yogananda and Lahiri Mahashaya and Babaji and Krishna, and we're just going to make sure everybody's included here, and I think that's terrific. And what's also cool for me is that would have been where the cash register was. And you can just barely see on the edge over here, there's a very large book, and it's the Bhagavad Gita. And it's open to the page in which Krishna is saying, I am the creative nature of the universe, and you can find me within. What a great, that was our last day. What a great way to end the trip, except that evening I got to listen to this confederate of Ravi Shankar play his sitar. And I went into heaven. On the river Ganges, people cleansing themselves, people being cremated, their bodies being cremated. The evening sunset service, boy, I've never heard such a loud lullaby in my life. You can see these on YouTube. It's 7 priests, and they each do 7 different offerings to Mother Ganga, and the bells are ringing, and the drums are playing, and the chants are chanting, and it's loudspeakers, and it's bright lights, and it just goes on and on every single night. And there are thousands of people watching. You can just see a few in the boats here, and I'm on the 5th tier of people watching. And then we went out the next morning onto the river, and I was able to allow a sacrifice, if you will, a small puja for my grandmother and for a friend of mine who had passed on my way to India, who had lived in India, and her daughter asked me to say a prayer for her, and so I was able to do that. So there were some completions for me that was really marvelous. But the question of universalism was the constant question in my mind. As I said in my write-up for this talk, when grandmother came back from India, her younger daughter said she came back more Hindu than Christian, but she remained a Methodist for the rest of her life. And nonetheless, when we would talk privately, when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, we would talk about reincarnation. We would talk about the fakirs that she had seen who could be put in a box and come out 5 days later, or the person that she had seen get up and walk, having been lame, and the blind who could see after someone was able to do a really profound blessing. And so she had seen these things in greater and let me know that they were possible. She had seen Sufis and Muslims and Hindus, and there had been one time when the Hindu farmers had come running out to her husband and said, Sahib, Sahib, we need you to kill the peacocks. We can't, and they're eating our crops. So they had peacock for Thanksgiving that year. All these kinds of experiences that she had, she brought into my growing up. And the stories, were part of, every year we would have a feast, we'd dress in saris and make puri and chapati and curry and all of these things. And we would listen to grandmother's stories. And Mom would talk about the monkeys. And grandmother's stories always covered every religious tradition. For her, there was no distinction. That the Christ mind was the one mind that all beings were aiming for. That the purpose, the dharma of life was to be fully who we were here to be. And she understood that and shared that with me. And so I had delayed going back to India because I didn't want my memories through her to be obscured by everything I was hearing from people. I heard all these horrible stories that didn't fit the memories that my grandmother had given me. And I was delighted that when I was there, what I saw was a century later, the next level in Indian experience. The conflict is hard, but it was going on when she was there. She worked with Gandhi. The conflict was there. But she also saw that for every person who took the time to think, and it didn't matter whether they cooked on a fire in the middle of their stone house. And I actually saw a billboard where it says, "No more smoke in my kitchen, I'm using natural gas." And it didn't matter whether the person was, a priest in a temple or a Christian missionary there to teach the kids or whatever. That all those who thought realized there is only one. No one is left behind. And that's what I found with my Hindu-Christian guide, my Sikh driver, the American housewives, the Desperate Housewives of Maryland, the one very lost soul who came because her mama died when she was a kid and she promised she'd bring her to the Ganges. And she had a card. I got to do that service for her. All of those pieces just went to prove that if we don't focus on the conflict, we can see we're all one and always have been. And ultimately, we all will know. Thank you very much.